This episode is another in our Energy and Environment Review series, in which Ballard's energy and environmental lawyers will address the energy evolution driven by climate change, renewable energy innovation, electrification, and energy efficiency, as consumers, generators, and investors alike strive for a sustainable future. The episode features a discussion of environmental commodities, like carbon credits, what they are, the different forms that exist, and how the market for them has developed and continues to evolve. Leading the discussion is Brendan Collins, a partner in Ballard's Philadelphia office, who is the practice leader of the firm's manufacturing group and an environmental lawyer who devotes his practice primarily to clients in the electric power sector and the oil and gas industry. Brendan's guest is Bill Flederbach, President and CEO of ClimeCo Corporation, a leader in the management and development of environmental commodities. So with that, let's turn the episode over to Brendan and Bill.
Hello, this is Brendan Collins, an environmental law partner at Ballard Spahr. And my guest today is Bill Flederbach, the president and CEO of ClimeCo, a full-service environmental commodities firm. Bill's here to talk to us today about the company's business and the developing markets in today's economy for sustainability services. Hello, Bill.
Hey, Brendan. Thanks for having me.
Very pleased to have you with us here today. I should also say that we're proud to count ClimeCo among the clients of Ballard Spahr and recognize the value that it brings to all of its customers in the field. And so talking about that, Bill, can you explain to our listeners what exactly a full-service environmental commodities firm is?
Absolutely, Brendan. I think maybe to explain that it'll be beneficial to say how we started the firm. When I had started ClimeCo, it was really coming off of the Kyoto Protocol days, working internationally, developing projects that reduce carbon dioxide under the clean development mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol, working in developing countries as defined by Kyoto. And monetizing those carbon reductions to the United Nations, and then bringing those carbon credits into Annex 1 developed countries. So it's really a part of a global cap and trade mechanism. And one of the things that I noticed when I was working for the firm I was with at the time was that they were very focused on one specific project type, and it really didn't scale well. They were focused on swine farms and collecting methane and converting to energy, primarily in Mexico and Brazil and Southeast Asia. So when they had a lot of successes and a lot of failures, and ultimately went bankrupt. I kind of wrote part of ClimeCo's business plan, leveraging my experiences there. And one of the things that they failed to do is create scale. So, imagine, they had 400 digesters in operation, and the most they've ever generated from a carbon credit standpoint, and every carbon credit's a metric ton of CO2 reduced, was around 1.5 million tons. And, we have some projects that do that by themselves, so we really wanted to look at, when we started ClimeCo, where can we create a project type or bring technology to the market where we could reduce greenhouse gases at scale to reduce our marginal cost of abatement. Really to put us at a competitive advantage, looking at scalable carbon dioxide reductions or carbon credits. And so when we started the company, it was really as a developer. So, how do we become a full supply, or how do we have this whole supply chain of environmental commodities? It was starting with knowing how to build things, putting steel in the ground, designing projects that could go into fertilizer production plants. Very specifically, we focused on nitrous oxide abatement technology within the ammonia nitrate process, or the nitric acid production. And, nitrous oxide, as we know it, as laughing gas, isn't a laughing matter, right, to the climate. And, it's 298 times stronger than carbon dioxide.
So when you started out with an eye on the Kyoto Protocol and these international clean development mechanism projects?
Yeah, definitely in my career, but for ClimeCo, we started in North America. We really wanted to, we started ClimeCo, really the thought was in '08, launched in '09. So kind of riding Obama administration, really getting excited about a potential Waxman-Markey bill, a federal cap and trade bill. And we all know where that went. It fell to the wayside of healthcare, right? So certainly when we were looking at developing scalable carbon credits, it was to try to position our clients in those carbon credits as a mechanism within the Waxman-Markey bill. So if customers needed to procure offsets, our offsets were defined in Waxman-Markey as an eligible offset type. So that was an early positioning of the firm.
With the U.S. not being a full participant in the Kyoto Protocol, were those North American plants then in Mexico or other participating countries?
Yeah, so at ClimeCo, we only focused on the U.S. to start, and then we moved up into Canada. So it was always for either initially it was for a federal cap and trade program that we were hoping to see developed under Obama, and then we quickly migrated into California since Assembly Bill 32 initially went in to act in 2013, but into conception long before that under the Schwarzenegger leadership. So we went from a federal cap and trade program and said, okay, well, if our credits, if that isn't going to exist, where can our offset credits go next? So then we went to lobby California and to see whether or not we could get our N2O based offsets into the California market as a compliance offset, as an offset that's eligible for use for industries capped under the Assembly Bill 32 program.
So you mentioned compliance offsets. Maybe you can cover for us a little of the distinctions between compliance offsets versus voluntary offsets or credits, and what different needs those different types of credits might meet.
Yeah. So, in the US and California, that's the only really compliant offset market. Up in Canada, of course, we're in Alberta and they have a compliant offset market there as well. And some other emerging markets in Ontario, and Quebec is linked with California. So there is this quill work of compliance offsets. And really when the compliance offsets came about, the California very specifically, they looked at all of the registries that were already generating offsets. We were already generating offsets. They were viewed as voluntary offsets at the time. So the California regulators looked at all the registries and they said, well, which protocols do we like? Which ones make sense to us? Which ones do we want to support? And really, California only wanted to support as much as they thought they needed, because in some ways they didn't want surplus offsets. They wanted to balance the offset supply with what they envisioned to be the offset demand, which I would argue was a silly approach. But that was their initial view. So when they looked at the registries, they handpicked, cherry picked, and it could be, well, I liked forestry, or this one makes sense to me. They like rice cultivation, which didn't generate any credits in reality. But one of the screens or filters, Brendan, that was important was that they said if there's an offset type that's out there in a registry, it may be really high quality, but if that sector that they're creating those offsets from are regulated in California, they cannot allow that as a compliance grade offset, because that sector, that NAICS, right, is governed under the cap. And I think that's where we ran into another wall, Brendan, in the early days of ClimeCo, was that we had technologies going in the fertilizer space, very focused, like a rifle, in that space, because we saw, potential 20 million tons a year of credits from our technologies, potentially harvesting. So when we were looking at California, we were hoping that could be a fit. And then we hit that other wall as an early entrepreneur, and you call it white knuckle strategy, right? Like now what? So now what was, well, what do we do? Well, we better learn how to sell this into the voluntary market. So I would say that ClimeCo, only through a white knuckle strategy, which I'm really pleased about now, was a pioneer in voluntary markets, because we learned how to market this offset. And we found out who was interested in offsetting their emissions and who would want to buy on a voluntary basis. And we're a pioneer in the voluntary market space as a result. We later got into the compliance space by buying a firm that had a lot of compliance eligible offsets, Brendan. But that was a plug-in merger that we did later.
So we're now talking about the period 2013 to 2015 now, and ClimeCo becomes a leader in voluntary offsets. Who's buying them and why?
When our first purchase ever, and I remember it to this day because I thought, we really proved it. We proved the model. We had a project. In fact, we did a press release on it. We had a project in Illinois reducing nitrous oxide. And again, once we reduce nitrous oxide, for every metric ton of nitrous oxide that we voluntarily destroy, we actually generate 298 certificates, right? So that's the global warming potential coming into play. So we were creating all these offsets in Illinois, and an energy company in Illinois came to us and said, they were a pioneer in wanting to provide carbon neutral natural gas. So how do they do that? Well, they calculate all their users. So they may go out to you this was at the retail level, Brendan. They would go out to you and say, hey, Brendan, are you interested in having carbon neutral natural gas for your furnace? And, you may say yes. So if you check yes, what they're going to do is they're going to calculate the amount of CO2 emissions associated with your consumption. And then they're purchasing our carbon credits in the background, and they're essentially retiring them against your emissions. And they're certifying that as you actually offsetting your combustion emissions associated with the natural gas that you buy. So that was like the first energy company that came to us. And one of the things that they were interested in, Brendan, is that they were an Illinois specific utility. The fact that we had an Illinois specific project meant a lot to them.
So the home heating sector and the industrial commercial heating sector certainly generate a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that are ripe for offset. But that's not the only market in which you've been selling your offsets, is it?
No, it isn't. So, I think, although an important one. So we're actually really, really strong in even neutralizing LNG shipments overseas. So now you're getting a lot of the big maritime fleets looking at way to deliver carbon neutral shipments. So it's now it's gone so far, but I would say that, some of the theme parks, we would, that would want to go carbon neutral. We would participate with theme parks, without saying who they are. We would really be in Silicon Valley with leading companies that wanted to be carbon neutral on a voluntary basis. I would say we work with airlines back in the day. We just did another airline right now, Air, which is an amazing company providing a carbon neutral flight. So I would say, we've marketed pretty much to every sector. But one of the things that we've done is no matter what project type that we're marketing, Brendan, we're always looking at the supply chain or the use of the underlying product. So if we're reducing N2O from a fertilizer plant, we may be looking at that fertilizer supply chain and approaching folks and saying, hey, we know that part of your footprint, if you really look at your scope 3 emissions and your downstream emissions is associated with fertilizer production. So as part of your carbon neutral strategy, I think it's really a great story if you start sourcing carbon credits from within your supply chain. So, our offset type, Brandon, have grown so much since those days of nitric acid. I would say, it may be beneficial if I would just explain how wide our portfolio is now. Would that be helpful?
I think that would be terrific.
All right. So, one of the things that we always say, I wrote a blog on this and I'm really passionate about whatever you could do to stop the CO2 or greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere. If you can do that at a reasonable marginal cost, you should. Let's focus on getting it before it goes into the atmosphere. But let's realize that there's a lot of talk and a lot of buzz right now about direct air capture and ways to sequester carbon once it's in the atmosphere, right? So there's a lot in the atmosphere currently, and what do we do with it? So I think, what we've created over time is a real balanced portfolio of stopping the molecule before it's emitted, as well as technologies and investments that sequester it once it already is emitted, because we certainly have clients that want to procure or invest in projects over a wide range of project types. And if I were to explain the pendulum real quickly, it would be, industrial gas like nitric acid. We also work with nylon 6,6 plants and adipic acid, again, abating N2O. So, that's kind of the industrial gas side, but we also work with refrigerant collections. One of our partners is right in Philadelphia that helps us collect and clean R12 and R11 and R500 refrigerants from old refrigerators, etc. We collect that until we have approximately 30,000 pounds or an ISO tank, and then we send it for incineration. And why do we do that? Well, we're preventing that old refrigerant that's banned under the Montreal Protocol from new production, but you can still resell it. Well, we're preventing that from going back into old equipment and leaking. So just by destroying refrigerants, we're creating carbon. We're involved in methane projects with landfills and digesters, and those are some of the more industrial types. And then if you swing the pendulum over to our investments in nature-based, we call it nature-based solutions is kind of the buzzword now. And it's a little scary because there's a lot of fly-by-nighters coming into like soil sequestration and no tillage. And, we've seen all these things before, Brendan, years ago under the Chicago Climate Exchange. So now the USDA and the market's coming back to, soil enrichment. And that's part of our portfolio now, but we want to do it right. So we're actually launching in a pilot program with a big grower to look at all the different levers that we can actually increase CO2 sequestration at scale in farm fields. But that's one type of nature-based solution. The other ones that we're involved in is a 1 million acre reforestation project with our partner Restore the Earth in what we call the Amazon of the United States, the Mississippi River Basin. So that's pretty exciting. We've got 4,000 acres that are going to go into planting, the first big step towards the 1 million acre project. We also get involved with improved forest management projects on ways to manage forests more sustainable, and then also looking at mangroves. Actually, so one of our passions is protecting actually increasing resiliency against hurricanes, et cetera, and floodwaters with rehabilitating mangroves. And mangroves themselves are like a forest, so you're going to sequester carbon. And a lot of these nature-based projects have so many what we call co-benefits, Brendan. So you're improving water quality, habitat, and these are things that are being talked about in like ecometric models. How do you quantify all the other benefits associated with reforestation? And that's something that we're keeping a keen eye on as well. But you can see that the portfolio surely went from industrial to the whole gamut. And, one of our strategies, Brendan, is to have a project type for everybody, whether or not we're developing it or whether or not we're buying it and sourcing it or investing in it ourselves and keeping it in our portfolio.
Now, each of these projects, Bill, corresponds to some protocol for that validates the various criteria that one looks to for these offsets, like additionality and just the quantity of carbon to credit. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those validation mechanisms are and what are the ones that seem to be most prevalent in use?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you mentioned that because I see there's a lot of fly-by-nighters coming because they are. And I think, foundationally, as we develop these programs, we wanted to create something that was credible, fungible, tradable, serialized, and done in such a way that it always had a registry and third-party verifiers involved. And I would say that the two leading registries that we work with, there's actually, I would say, probably three leading globally, is the Climate Action Reserve, And the Climate Action Reserve is really a leader both in voluntary and compliance grade offsets. We for years, I haven't looked at the numbers lately, we were the largest developer in the Climate Action Reserve. So what does that mean to have a registry, and what's their role? So if I were to explain our nitric acid project type, before we were able to do that, we had to go to the Climate Action Reserve and say, is this a protocol that you would support? Is this something that you would dedicate your resources to help us develop a robust protocol, not just ClimeCo, but could you help us put together a working group of stakeholders that understood this market? And some of the stakeholders that, when they said yes to us, when they had a public meeting, they socialized it, and they thought the opportunity was great enough. ClimeCo convinced them that the opportunity was great enough. And when they went to the public, they saw reception. They saw that the Fertilizer Institute was interested in learning more. So they realized there was an opportunity to create carbon offsets at scale. And they went ahead and raised the flag and said, with ClimeCo, we're going to support this. So then at that point, Brendan, ClimeCo became a work group member. We contributed to the development of the protocol with our expertise, but there were other experts that were invited to the work group by the Climate Action Reserve. So it became very transparent. It wasn't just us trying to write a protocol. It was a lot of experts in the subject matter, writing that protocol. And then after that protocol gets finalized, it goes to public review, just like a Title V operating permit does, right? It goes through public review. There's comment. They have to address public comment. At the end of that, we have, if we're successful, and we have a protocol that's housed under the Climate Action Reserve. And then once the protocol is there, it becomes open for the public. It's not ClimeCo's protocol. It's an open architecture, right? So any industry could use it. So once I may spend a year to write a protocol, but once it's public, I need to realize that, it doesn't mean that I'm going to have 100% of the market, right? So we need to make sure we go out there and let the industry know why we're the firm to select in order to develop that project type. But it all starts with a protocol. In those protocols, like you mentioned, the word additionality. Additionality hurdles are so critical for these protocols. Is it business as usual? Is it required by a state regulatory requirement or a federal regulatory requirement? If any of those three are yes, then there's no voluntary offset that could be generated from it. There are concerns about projects that are so in the money that you should do it otherwise, or financial additionality. But there's a lot of additionality hurdles to overcome. The real success of these programs is the carbon revenue that's generated from the carbon credits enough to actually accelerate projects that wouldn't have otherwise happened? That's a successful project. And I think that's the purpose of the registries. And the registries play another role too, is when we're actually creating the carbon, then Brendan, we have to bring on third-party auditors that are actually certified by the registry under that protocol type. And then once that's done, then the registry audits it again. So you can see that there's a lot of checks and balances to create one credit. And the Vera is another registry that we use extensively. And then also the last one is American Carbon Registry. So I would say that those are the three primary registries, Brendan, that the buyers, when they look at offsets coming from those, there's a natural tendency to say those are quality because it's made it through multiple audits.
And all of those have to do with projects that are being undertaken to cut carbon, and they do cut carbon. And the offset transaction itself is merely a way of allocating the benefit of the carbon reduction to different sources.
Yep, and that's transacted like a house, like any other property, right? So there's, usually a lot of it's business to business, Brendan, under voluntary emission reduction purchase agreements. Everybody has acronyms. We call them VERPAs. But that's really transferring all of the rights, all the environmental attributes associated with those carbon credits. You're transferring for somebody else to use, and I think it's an important point to bring up, however, is that, it's really from a double counting perspective, how a firm accounts for those reductions once they sell them and how they communicate those reductions to their shareholders is really important. It's something that we really focus on. So we've developed white papers around this, kind of leveraging existing protocols that are out there. The World Resource Institute, for instance, WRI protocols, greenhouse gas protocols, and there's some vagueness in accounting. But essentially, when a client sells those offsets, they can't quantitatively count them against their own reduction goals. Then that's double counting at its best, right? So they can communicate to their shareholders that they're investing in projects, they're reducing their greenhouse gases, but they have to acknowledge that they're actually selling the right for another firm to count that against their ledger. And that's really important.
That is important. And it's a terrific segue to one of the biggest developments, I would say, in the last couple of years. I mean, you mentioned when ClimeCo was starting, there were a few very forward-thinking companies that would be looking for offsets. There were maybe some more consumer-facing brands that thought there would be brand value in offsetting their emissions. But now it seems like everybody is looking for a way to develop that sustainability profile and develop it quickly. Develop it not just through long-term changes in their method of operation, but more short-term solutions, which almost always fall into two categories in my experience: either some sort of renewable power purchase agreement or some sort of carbon offset agreement, or more likely a combination of both. Can you tell us what ClimeCo has seen in the market over the last couple of years?
We saw an initial surge under the Trump administration. Probably not something that the Trump administration envisioned, but I think a lot of leaders of companies, once they realized that the Trump administration was going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, that leaders stepped up. And we saw a surge of voluntary action in the last 4 years since Obama stepped down. And we didn't see that before. And I call it not that same surge. I think it's a little bit of lethargism, in industry, waiting for the federal policy to come out and cap and trade. And then, when leaders of companies realized it wasn't coming, and not only wasn't it coming, the U.S. was really, leadership was denying climate change existed. It really it was a catalyst for change. So I think we saw a lot of activity in the years leading up to the Biden administration. I would say that COVID put a pause on it only for a couple months, to be honest with you. It really kind of just slowed down the demand a little bit until everybody realized that most the fortunate companies were going to be okay. And then they got soon, I was nervous, Brendan, that, voluntary carbon and voluntary reductions are really great when companies are doing well. But when they're not hitting their P&L targets, what's the first thing the CFO could cut? It's those voluntary purchases, right?
That's right. That's right. Not to mention the decline in transportation emissions,
exactly.
Which was a big story, and electric power emissions. Two big stories contributing to a drop in carbon emissions in 2020.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of ramifications to that, even in California, with emissions going down and a lack of demand for, allowance prices flattened out as did offsets, because the emissions naturally went down during COVID. But I would say that, you mentioned renewable energy. We get really involved in renewable energy programs as well. Whether, sometimes it's just direct transactions, sometimes it's virtual PPA type programs. But I think our clients now, the pressure for ESG and the pressure for, these science-based net zero targets, whether or not you're BlackRock's an investor or Vanguard's an investor, these investors now are looking at the carbon intensity of their investments. And, I know our clients right up through the petrochemical that have large investors are getting calls at the board level to say, what are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint? So the pressure now, Brendan, and it's been just accelerated under the Biden administration. It's almost that perfect wave of saying, okay, there was movement under the Trump administration, but now that the Biden administration is here, we better get our stuff. We better get our stuff in order. We're getting a lot of pressure from investors, just from society, from individuals, all wanting to see a more sustainable story. So I think I've never seen a demand like we see today. So to your point, there's a lot of people coming to the market that want to start looking at ways that they can reduce their footprint. And some of how we lead with that is actually an expansion of our sustainability, our ES&G practice. So we brought in a new leader, to take that practice to a new level and start to work with our large clients on creating the roadmap. What does ES&G mean to them? And I'm not just talking about environment. I'm talking about really looking at the full ES&G spectrum, and getting a lot more involved with DEI issues with our clients as it's interwoven into that topic. But I think, this classic roadmap, this classic going out to your stakeholders and doing a real materiality assessment, so you can really identify what you should be focused on. And that's been really important now, Brendan, because the market is screaming for that service. And I think we're also seeing, activity well beyond carbon. So, we just launched our plastic initiatives with plastic credits, and we have a new director of plastics that came on board because we all know that ocean plastics is a big, big issue right now with the circular economy. And but part of the ES&G story that we're helping our clients navigate is not only around carbon footprinting, but around plastic footprinting as well.
So do you see that model offset used to, offset in otherwise inevitable emissions as being adaptable to other areas like plastics?
Absolutely. In fact, Vera was the one registry that I had mentioned. They are launching a plastic credit program. It's not a carbon credit program. It's a plastic credit program. And there's two different plastic types. There's waste collection credits. And this would be, we're looking at like Indonesia and other areas where they're actually going out and they're collecting plastics to prevent them from entering the ocean. Now that's an area that we're focused on. So there's waste collection credits, it's called. And then there's a waste recycling credit. And if your waste collected actually goes to waste recycling, you could have you could have two credits associated with that ton. And instead of trading on a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, it trades on a ton of plastic, a metric ton of plastic recovered. So we're working on a project right now where we're looking to source and actually be part of a great story where our money to source the waste collection credits are funding folks in a developing economy to actually improve their lifestyle and to improve their family. It's pretty cool. So I think that's I would say that the capital markets, Brendan, are where we believe that capital markets can be an accelerator of technology. I could see us investing in an ocean plastic recovery technology. And part of our investment in the payback would be through the credits. And because we could bring those credits to our clients that are trying to create a more sustainable story around their plastic usage. And I think, so we really believe in the capital markets to solve problems. And I think the plastic credit is going to be no different. And I'm really excited about ClimeCo's early leadership in that. It's just one of our areas to expand into. And there are others. We're expanding into ammonia as a fuel source for the marine sector. The whole clean hydrogen or blue hydrogen, blue-green hydrogen, ammonia stories, low carbon intensity. That's, we're trying to figure out, how, in fact, we have a new product coming to market that I'm really excited about on trying to identify the low carbon attributes of hydrogen or ammonia and look at creating new procedures and new standards where we could strip that attribute and sell it almost like a renewable energy credit. So, if our ammonia is being produced at a location where I have a new ammonia technology coming in, and the buyers of the ammonia in the Midwest aren't willing to pay a premium for that low carbon intensive ammonia. Why shouldn't we be able to create a program where we can strip that environmental attribute like a renewable energy credit and sell it separate from the ammonia molecule itself, just like the energy world. So we're creating new programs now as well, because I really believe that the green ammonia space is really going to be where the action is, hydrogen and ammonia. And we're going to be seeing ammonia actually be used as fuel to replace hydrocarbon fuel in the future. So that's the innovation that's happening, and we're just trying to keep up with it.
That's terrific, Bill, and I really appreciate the breadth of ClimeCo's operations. As I said to you offline, I'm always fascinated, especially to hear about the different kind of projects that you're working on and the different ways in which the capital markets can be harnessed to help the world deal with the environmental problems it faces. With that diversity of opportunities out there to use the capital markets as a way to offset emissions and other environmental problems, what would you tell a company that was today rolling up its sleeves and looking to make real progress in reducing its environmental footprint and in improving its ESG profile?
Yeah, I always say, you need to look under the hood first, right? So, I always say, start with a good inventory, understand your footprint. It could be your greenhouse gas footprint. It could be, what do you want to focus on? Do you want to focus on your scope 1 direct emissions or your utility, consumption, your scope 2, or do you want to even go further and look at your scope 3, your supply chain? But start to understand, your impact, and that impact could certainly go beyond carbon, into your waste streams, into your, we talked about plastics earlier, but, really understand your impact. I would say one of the things that I always enjoy when I work with Emily and our team in the sustainability practice is really developing that roadmap for clients. And that roadmap really, really involves stakeholder engagement. So, if you're a company producing a widget, reach out to your stakeholders. What do they view as important? What do they want to see from you? But that materiality assessment is really important. But I call it that kind of a 5-year roadmap. And one of the things that I always say too, if you're looking at greenhouse gas reductions, start to understand what the marginal cost is for your company to reduce those within your fence line. And you may find out that there's reduction opportunities in-house. And we always say, Brendan, start with that. Offsets are really a fill mechanism if you're not able to do that on a cost-effective basis within your facility. And we believe offsets play an important role, but we don't think that they should be your focus. We think, you should look what you can do first, and that's part of your roadmap. And then as you're marching down that net zero path, look at how offsets or renewable energy or the plastic credit program, how all these other programs can play a role, because you're actually financing projects that are really making a difference, likely at a marginal cost lower than what it would have cost you to implement it within your own factory. And I think that's important, is get the most bang for the buck, because these are global problems, Brendan. So by investing in an offset project and taking claim to that, that's a real success story. But it all starts with the roadmap, Brendan.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. We really appreciate those insights and all the experience you bring to the table and all the good that's being done by ClimeCo on behalf of its many clients. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brendan. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks again to Brendan Collins and his guest, Bill Flederbach. Make sure to visit our website, www.ballardspar.com, where you can find the latest news and guidance from our attorneys. Subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. If you have any questions or suggestions for the show, please email podcast@ballardspar.com. Stay tuned for a new episode coming soon. Thank you for listening.